Zigbet Tarash once said of the game of chess, "One doesn't have to play well, it's enough to play better than your opponent." Whether you know a little or a lot about chess, we'll be making this handcrafted chessboard in the shop today. So,
how about a nice game of chess?
if you're like me, you've spent a lot of time watching woodworking videos on YouTube, both for information and enjoyment. One of the woodworking YouTube channels I visit often is Would You Make It with Mike McCrory. I drew a lot, and I mean a lot, of inspiration for this chessboard from watching one of his videos where he makes two regulation-sized chessboards. I highly recommend giving them a view. I'm starting off with some pre-cut and milled walnut and maple stock. Yes, I could spend the time milling down the specific dimensions from larger stock, but sometimes it's just easier to start a little closer where you want to be at the outset of a project. While these pieces are supposed to be 2" by 2" square, they were just over or just shy of that, so I'm running them through my drum sander to get each piece to the exact same width on all four sides. It's critical at this stage to get them perfectly square and equal, as they're going to form a checkered pattern that can't be off in the slightest or otherwise ruin this project from the outset. After I've got them sanded to size, I prep them for glue up. I'm using sheets of parchment paper placed over two pieces of scrap lumber for cauls. One of these will be placed on the bottom with the parchment facing up to prevent the glue from sticking, and the other will be placed on the top of the glue up with the parchment facing down. I'll then use standard bar clamps on the milled stock and a couple of C-clamps on the cauls to exert pressure to keep the whole thing in alignment. The next day, I'll remove the clamps, cauls, and parchment paper and then send this entire block through the drum sander. I need to take special care to make sure I'm only removing the slightest amount off of this block. Really, I'm only removing the small amount of dried glue squeeze out with these passes. Remember that I had already previously sanded each one of the blocks to a 2" by 2" square. If I take too much off, I'll throw off the checkered pattern. If you saw during the previous glue up, each of the pieces of walnut stock were just slightly longer than the maple stock, so I'm simply squaring up the edge on the table saw. Now we've got the base piece from which the checkerboard pattern will be cut. The width of this assembled piece is just slightly under 12 inches wide. A standard chessboard has 64 squares arranged 8 horizontal by 8 vertical in an alternating pattern. As you can see, this piece is already configured in the alternating pattern and is 8 squares long. I'm simply going to make 7 equal width cuts along the length to obtain the 8 pieces that I need to make the chessboard pattern. Since the width of my table saw blade is 1/8 of an inch, I need to calculate that loss of overall width each time I'm making a cut. Once I've made all the calculations, I'll set a stop block on my table saw sled, which happens to be 1¼ inches, so that I can make the same repetitive cut. When I get to the last cut, it's easier, safer, and more accurate to make it without the sled and use the table saw's fence. We're now on to the second major glue up in this project. I'll arrange the checkerboard pattern first by laying each piece on its side, then alternating every other piece. Before the glue up, I'm going to slightly sand the edges of each piece with 120 grit sandpaper. I don't want any small burrs to prevent a nice tight glue up. After blowing away the sanding dust, I'm now ready to begin. I'll perform this glue up the same way I did the first by using cauls, parchment paper, bar clamps, and C-clamps. While the video is moving at lightning speed, rest assured that I was meticulous about the lineup of the checkered pattern during the process. The next day, the clamps and cauls come off and we're headed back to the drum sander. While the drum sander is great for leveling out a project and that initial material removal, I'm going to follow up with an orbital sander to remove any lines from the lower grit sandpaper that the drum sander has left behind. Only once in the sanding process am I going to raise the grain by rinsing the board with water. I'll then let the board dry fully over the next day or two before proceeding with this project. With the baseboard now complete, it's time to look at a border. I wasn't really sure which route I was going to go when selecting the border until this nice piece of walnut found its way into my shop. Thank you, Steve Gentry, for the magnificent find. From this, I'm going to cut roughly 2 3/4 inch border strips, which will be mitered on the corners. But first I'm going to cut this down to a little more manageable size. What is cut must be sanded, so these border strips will take a few passes through the drum sander. Ah, it's new blade time, or should I say dado time. I received this set of dado blades last Christmas as a gift and have yet to use them, but I wanted to make a dado cut around the entire outside edge of the chessboard base and then also use it to make the tenons on the border pieces. In order to do any of this requires me to change out the blades of my table saw. The width of these two dado blades together is 1/4 inch, which is what I want the width of my cut to be around the base of the chessboard. I also want that cut to be 1/4 inch deep, so I'm using my vertical ruler to adjust the height of the dado blades to that measurement. Since you only get one shot at cuts like these, I'm going to make a test cut with a piece of scrap wood. Well, it's lucky I did. As you can see, my riving knife prevents me from pushing this piece of wood all the way through. Hey, things don't always go as planned, but at least this mistake was made on scrap and not on a more expensive and possibly critical piece of wood for this project. With the riving knife now removed, I can successfully make the cut. With all the test cuts complete, I'm ready to move on to make those same cuts on the walnut border pieces. But I want to take some extra time here to inspect the grain orientation of each of these pieces. Ultimately, these need to be arranged in a pattern that's pleasing and makes sense. But if I make these tenon cuts with complete disregard to grain orientation, I don't get a second chance. I don't want to wish I had made a different choice later on in this project. A little time spent here will yield a more satisfying outcome later. Once I've decided on the orientation of the sides, I want to mark top, bottom, left, and right, and also indicate the inside edge, or the edge that the tenon will be cut on. I don't want to make a mistake this far into the project. After a few minor adjustments to the fence, I'm ready to start making my tenon cuts on the walnut border pieces. Now I'm ready to make the groove that the tenons on the border pieces will fit into. I made this little jig for my table saw fence to help me keep the chessboard upright and perpendicular to the table saw with simple clamps. The jig slips over the fence and allows me to simply push the whole thing with an easy motion without worrying that the cut will go astray at any point. Looks pretty good. Now that I'm happy with the first cut, I simply unclamp the chessboard and rotate it 1/4 turn, clamp it back into place, and make each successive cut until I've made it all the way around the board. Pretty sweet, huh? Jigs are awesome. Just before assembling the chessboard base and border pieces, I want to give them a quick once over with the orbital sander. Now I'm ready to make the miter cuts on the border pieces at the four corners of the chessboard. I found this trick on YouTube for getting really precise cuts for your miters. Rather than using a pencil, take a utility knife to identify your cut marks. When gluing the border into the groove around the chessboard base, I'm dabbing glue in the middle and on each end rather than using glue along the entire length. This should allow the border some flexibility to shift over time. With a couple of 24-inch bar clamps, I apply light pressure so as to allow myself the ability to shift the border as needed during the glue up. Remember, I'm trying to align the 45-degree mitered corners as perfectly as I can, and I may need to finesse things a little to achieve just that. Once I'm happy, I'll add more pressure to the clamps and also clamp the corners in the vertical direction with a couple of pieces of scrap wood. Overnight, I let 3 sides of the border dry, and will now glue and clamp the remaining side using the same procedure. Now that all of the border assembly is dried, it's time to remove the clamps. I'll need to do some light sanding on the dried glue squeeze out. Then, I'll inspect each corner to see if I have any other issues that I need to address. I'm not going to put any sort of edge on this border, but I do want to remove the sharpness, so I'm simply using a piece of 120 grit sandpaper and lightly going over the edges and corners. So I did identify a corner where the two mitered borders just didn't come together quite as nicely as I would have wanted them to. I'm not sure if this was due to clamping or the miter cut itself. Whatever the reason, it certainly needs to be addressed. I can easily fix this with a little walnut sanding dust and glue. I'll gather the dust over the seam, add a spot of glue, and mix it with the tips of my fingers to create a paste. Then I'll begin massaging it into the seam to fill the void. I may need to do this a couple of times until I'm happy with the result, and then I'll let it dry overnight before sanding. In staying with Mike's design, I wanted to add splines at each of the border corners. In order to do this effectively, I made another jig specifically for that purpose. Again, I watch a lot of woodworking videos on YouTube and found several on how to make this spline jig. This jig is simply going to let me hold the entire chessboard at a 45-degree angle so that I can make a single pass with my table saw across each corner of the chessboard. With the chessboard nicely cradled in the jig, I can easily move it to make these precise cuts. Now it's just a matter of rotating the board 1/4 turn and repeating the process. I'll say it again, jigs are awesome. For the splines, I wanted them to contrast with the walnut, so I'm using my bandsaw to cut some thin strips of maple. I'll then run them through my drum sander to get them to the desired thickness to fit into the splines. You don't want these splines to be too loose. Actually, you want them to be a little on the snug side so that you don't end up with voids afterwards. Once I was happy with the thickness, I just added a little glue, used a rubber mallet to gently tap them fully into place, and then used a little downward pressure with a clamp. It's pretty much a rinse and repeat process for the other 3 corners. Using a Japanese pull saw, I'll remove the protruding edges of the spline. Then I'll come back with an orbital sander to sand the splines flush with the border. Since the bulk of the assembly of this chessboard is almost complete, I'm going to take a few minutes to sand the board all over with 320 grit sandpaper. As a last step, I'll rub the entire thing down with denatured alcohol to remove the fine dust left over from sanding. I really wanted to add the algebraic notation that some chessboards have to this board, but wasn't sure how I wanted to do it. Ultimately, I decided to use maple strips cut about 3/4 of an inch wide around the perimeter of the board, and then use my laser burner to engrave the alphanumeric characters. I start with 2-inch wide maple stock that was 3/4 of an inch thick and roughly cut it into thirds. Here's a quick tip for you. After sanding a specific species of wood, don't simply vacuum or dispose of the sawdust. Collect it in a small container so that you've got the dust to use for filling voids later. Over the past couple of years, I've managed to collect walnut, maple, cherry, padauk, and purple heart dust. After I've got the strips cut, I send them through the drum sander until they're about 1/8 inch thick. While I only need 4 of these strips of wood, you'll see later that the 5th piece gets used. Sometimes milling an extra piece comes in handy. After the maple strips are sanded down, I need to mark the specific location that I want the laser to burn each alphanumeric character. I'll also number my strips so that I know which side and orientation the numbers and letters should be positioned. Now it's on to the laser burner, but I've got to spend a little time getting things set up. So I do several test runs to make sure that the font and the size of the alphanumeric characters that I've chosen in the software burn clearly. I also need to set up some sort of alignment system on the laser so that I can make the same repetitive movement of the strip for each letter and number. I've clamped a small piece of wood as a straight edge along the bed of the laser, and also laser etched a line on my wasteboard so I know exactly where to move the maple strip as I burn each successive letter and number. After completing the letters, I now turn my attention to the vertical numbers. Now it's time to cut these strips to width. I first start by tilting my saw blade to 10 degrees just to give the slightest bevel to the maple strips. Then I start ripping the length. As you can see during this test cut, the distance between the blade and the fence was too shallow, and I was in danger of losing the cut strip down into the saw itself. If you ever need to make a narrow cut like this, you can use some tape to close that gap. With the gap now covered, I can safely make these narrow cuts. Using the same technique for marking my miters, I mark these strips and take them to my miter saw to cut to length. I also want to mark the angle indication in which each end of the strip will be cut. One end will be cut 45 degrees top to bottom, while the other end will be cut in the opposite direction. On the very last cut, tragedy strikes. For some reason, this particular strip gets caught on the blade and completely splits. While there were no injuries, I will just say this. Always wear safety goggles. Even if you've made cuts 100 times, there's always that 1 in 100 chance the cut doesn't go as planned. Remember that fifth strip I mentioned earlier? Having it saved me some valuable time. While I do need to go back and laser burn the letters on it, at least I didn't have to cut it and sand it to size. And now, with all the algebraic notation strips complete, they're ready for the glue up. After drying overnight, the clamps come off and the other two strips get added. After another overnight dry time, I'll remove the clamps and then lightly sand the maple strips and any other spots that need a quick once over, as we're getting ready to move on to the finishing stages of this chessboard. I'm going to start the finishing process by applying a coat of clear satin polyurethane with a brush. I'll let one side dry overnight and then repeat the process on the other side. After both sides have dried, I'll come back with 400 grit sandpaper and lightly sand the dried coat of polyurethane. Then I'll wipe off any dust with a clean cloth and repeat the process a total of 3 times. After 3 coats of brushed on satin polyurethane, I lay down a large drip cloth and move to a can spray on satin polyurethane. I'll apply 2 coats on each side, letting them dry between sides and coats, and then I'll apply 2 coats of a gloss polyurethane. After all the coats of poly have dried, I'm going to rub the entire board with Howard's Restore and Shine rubbing compound. This will give the wood a nice, polished, gloss finish. There's only one step left in the finishing process, and that's to apply a coat of Johnson's paste wax. This will help protect the chessboard. One of the last things I wanted to do was add some sort of felt bottom so that the board would slide on whatever surface it was placed. I didn't want to mar the surface on which it was placed, nor did I want the surface to do damage to the board. I also didn't want to cover the entire bottom with felt, as a lot of time and effort went into this project, and I want as much of it to remain visible as possible, even if the bottom wasn't a side you would often see. In the end, I decided on a 1-inch self-adhesive felt strip around the chessboard base. At each corner, I hand mitered the corners to match the 45-degree miters of the border, and I was pretty happy with the results. This project was about 3 weeks in the making, and it's been my pleasure to bring it to you. Thanks again to Mike McCrory at Would You Make It for the inspiration. I've also drawn inspiration from MTM Wood, so go and check out their YouTube channels. To date, this has been the most time-intensive project I've completed, but also the most rewarding. I think I used nearly every tool and technique at my disposal, including some new ones. I hope this inspires other woodworkers to give this project a try. As always, your comments, suggestions, likes, and subscriptions are appreciated and encouraged. Thanks for watching.